I also want to begin to say that I'm speaking from my home, which is on the campus of UBC, that is located on the traditional ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. It's a privilege to work and live on this land, and along with my children, to learn and play here. So it's a tremendous privilege to be here. We're very grateful for it. So I set myself up for a big topic today. I want to talk about Chinese taxation and a way of thinking about China's role in the world that's suggested by the story of Chinese taxation. China's role in the international order has become hugely controversial in the last few years. The narratives of many news commentary, scholarly publications suggest that this controversy has several components. So one is that China has been very powerful, has become very powerful internationally by virtue of the size of its economy. But secondly, China has enjoyed this spectacular economic success by tapping into the global order and especially benefiting from international trade. But China has not adhered to economic expectations of many advanced economies that opened their markets to China and otherwise supported China's own market liberalization. And of course, the Chinese Communist Party has continued its authoritarian rule and disregard for certain basic human rights. This further compounds our sense of disappointment and threat. So what I want to do is to offer you a narrative that hopefully sheds light on some of these current narratives and sentiments. My story is based on scholarly analysis of Chinese taxation, but I want to draw some analogies between that specialized field and the more general narrative about China's problematic rise. My overall thesis is that even what is supposed to be the best scientific theories of modern taxation we have are likely to be superficial, and that's revealed in their inadequacy in describing and explaining what has transpired in Chinese public finance. So I believe this unsatisfactory state of affairs probably holds also in other areas of law and policy. What this suggests to me is that confusion and surprise about institutional developments in China may have its root in erroneous understandings about our own institutions. So I want to articulate this possibility, which seems to me to present a great challenge. It's critical in thinking about the world's future with China to overcome our own intellectual complacencies. So I'll start by offering some background. So this is play slides. Okay, so here is a figure. So I just want to remind us that China has become a upper middle income country very recently. Here you see this graph. This is GDP per capita up until the early 2000s. So during the stretch in 1990 to 2000, during the time I was in graduate school, China's GDP per capita was around the level of sub-Saharan African countries, excluding high-income countries like South Africa. And so this rise of China's economy happened very recently. So only in 2018 did the income level in China reach that of Mexico's. Okay, so it's generally recognized that in low-income countries, it's very hard to build a well-functioning tax system. The lack of capacity for taxation in turn leads to the inability to provide public goods and services that are critical for economic development. So low tax capacity is part of the development trap faced by many nations. So if I simply tell you that China has successfully built a tax system, that is already something to take note of. So this is a more specific picture about the trajectory of Chinese taxation. What I show is the evolution of China's gross tax ratio, which is a simple but crude measure of a country's tax system is simply the total of tax revenue in the country divided by the country's GDP. And so what you see is that before the 1990s, especially in the 1980s, when China was still under a planned economy, the tax to GDP ratio was above 20%. It started plummeting in the late 80s, so that by 1995 it was already below 10%. And the reason was that prior to the 1990s, most taxes were collected from state-owned enterprises, and that's just a transition from the planned economy. During the stretch of time, the SOEs were failing, and so the government was losing a lot of revenue. After reaching this nadir, the gross tax ratio started recovering, so that by 2001, we have a gross tax ratio already above 15%. And by 2006 or 2007, we've reached above 20%, which is low by OECD standards, but very high by developing country standards. So this is just looking at this curve itself, we have a story of success. The story I want to tell today focuses on this stretch, starting from 1994 and ending in 2005. In 1994, there was a major tax reform that introduced many new taxes in China. This was roughly simultaneous with the decision to embrace a market economy in China's urban sectors. So in many ways, you can say this major tax reform in 1994 was the WTO moment in Chinese taxation. So to draw the analogy of China's rise in the global order, what are the analogies with China's later accession to the WTO? So the design of the tax reform in 1994 was significantly informed by foreign advice, including from the IMF, the World Bank, and other organizations and foreign governments. I will show you that there's much in this reform that should be familiar to people who are familiar with modern taxation in advanced economies. In around 1997, China implemented a tax administration reform to really implement the vision of the major tax reform. So this reform took several years. But in the 3 to 8 years after that, so during this stretch, the reform of tax administration was largely abandoned, and China developed a very different tax system that's quite alien to a Western understanding of tax policy and tax administration. But as you can see from this graph, the system continued on a path of relative success. So the core of my story is to identify the unexpected institutional decision that was made during this period. And my scholarly claim is that understanding these decisions actually requires a reconceptualization of the institutional foundations of modern taxation. Okay, so let's start with the 1994 tax reform, what I call Chinese taxation's WTO moment. So the most important thing to say is that new taxes were introduced that would become the main revenue sources. This included the value-added tax, broad-based excise taxes on services, corporate income tax applicable to domestically owned firms, and the personal income tax. So all of these taxes will subsequently see very dramatic rises in revenue, but most of them were pretty new in 1994. Before this time, domestic taxes were mainly collected from state and collectively owned enterprises. And in many cases, it's notable that this tax collection is subject to firm-specific bargaining. So how much do I pay is dependent on what the firm bargained with the tax collector. So in other words, it was not accordance with law at all. There are many commentaries about the 1994 tax reform. The one I want to focus on is there's an obvious question to be asked. When all these new taxes were introduced to China for the first time, how will these new taxes be collected? So interestingly, even in the 1980s, from the late 1970s to the early 1990s, China rapidly built up a tax administration workforce. Okay, and so the size of the workforce went from about 200,000 people to about to the high 600,000 people. So there was a subsequent increase in the overall workforce that was divided into two branches. I won't get into that, but overall, the most dramatic rise happened during this period. So in terms of having bodies going around collecting taxes, China already had that by the early 1990s. The problem was that they were collecting the wrong taxes. Okay, and so here you can see pictures of what happened in the 80s. At the beginning, people were still riding on bikes, collecting taxes from peasants. And here in the early 90s, we had some advanced technology, a motorcycle that can drive people around collecting taxes. So this was before 1994. So that's what happened before. It doesn't answer the question how the new taxes will be collected. And that question is answered in a decision issued by the State Council, which is the highest governance body in China, in December 1993. The State Council announced a new approach to tax administration. So there are several components. Most importantly, China was going to start for the first time to have a self-assessment system. So businesses or citizens are going to start filing tax returns for the first time. To help this, tax professions were going to develop to assist taxpayers with compliance, and tax administrators were going to provide better taxpayer services. Chinese tax administrators had not done audits before because there were no tax returns to audit. And so audit capacity was going to be built to enforce the law. And then the State Council also mentioned and really emphasized legislation and adjudication to give basis for taxation in legal norms. And these decisions began serious implementation in 1997. Okay, so my prediction is that this list of arrangements, institutional arrangements, do not strike you as very exciting. These are, good ideas, but maybe they're nothing to be very excited about. The argument I want to drive home is that actually this is extremely exciting and extremely unique. So I want to ask you to think about three questions to understand why these points are so important. The first is, can you imagine how a country can build a system like this when none had existed before? What is it like to start people filing tax returns for the first time and reading about tax law for the first time? The second question is more important. Can you imagine a lot of taxes being collected in a modern economy without these things in place? Okay. The reason that China, the State Council, decided to institute these arrangements is that the conception was that you cannot collect modern taxes without these institutions. But what has happened in China is that modern taxes eventually got collected precisely without these institutions. And so the idea that we would use these arrangements to collect taxes seemed immutable, but that is the basic arrangement that China violated. And then the final extraordinary thing is, as a tax scholar, I can tell you that we still don't have good social scientific theories about these institutions, so that we don't know why they matter. And there's even a lot of skepticism about the fact that these institutions matter. Okay. So I'm going to be, so this is the theme, sort of this, these present some of the central themes of the talk today. So let me just show you how extraordinary it is to set up a system when none existed before. So these are pictures from the early and mid 1990s. This is a picture of tax bureaus trying to give publicity to tax law. And so here you can win a lottery by showing knowledge of tax law. You can win a stereo player with cassette player. And here are tax officials standing there ready to tell people about tax law. Most importantly, taxpayer service halls began to be built around the country. At its height, there were about 60,000 tax offices in China. That's the year 1995. That's actually more post offices the country had back then. That number has come down since then. There are only 30,000 tax offices in China. But I looked online. If you think about how many Canada post offices there are in Canada, the entire country, the answer is about 6,000. And so in China, it's much easier to find a tax office than it is to find a Canada Post station in Canada. So initially, taxpayer service halls looked like this. As China got richer, they became buildings like buildings like this. And these taxpayer service halls left a major legacy, so that today they look like this. It's still very heavily used, and now you have very nice equipment, computers, and youthful people working in these institutions that were set up in the 1990s. Okay, so what I want to convey is that this is a huge amount of resource mobilization that was engaged in to implement this idea that people will need to file tax returns and get taxpayer services. To drive this point home a little more, I want to tell you about the story of one branch tax bureau in what's called the Huanggu district in Shenyang. So one of the average provinces in China. These pictures are in black and white. I don't know why, but they are from the mid-1990s. Oh, by the way, I was very pleased to be able to find these pictures before, because it's hard to find illustrations for taxation. So in the West, usually if you want to find an illustration, it's a pile of cash. And so in China, it's basically these pictures of taxpayer service halls. Okay, so this is mid-1990-95 Huanggu. And so even though color photos were common then, this is what people were doing. This is, I think, a musical synchronized fountains. People were amazed that now that they have that in their city. And this is a picture showing that counterfeit goods are being confiscated in the newly emerging market economy. And so this is a picture of market regulation, basically. What's on display are counterfeit goods that are taken by the government. And so in the city of Huanggu, there was an attempt to set up the taxpayer filing system. The district branch bureau collected tax from 8,000 private firms. The bureau had a 200 square meter taxpayer service hall, 25 staff members, 10 desktop computers. So it seems that they were reasonably prepared, but when the 8,000 businesses start bringing tax returns, long lines queued up at the taxpayer service center, and they cannot close. They cannot handle the tax returns fast enough. So the Huanggu Tax Bureau entered into an agreement with the local post office to get tax returns mailed in. And lines started queuing up at the post offices because everyone had to weigh their tax returns and pay special postage. So the post offices became jammed. So the local tax bureau and the local post office had to enter into an agreement to have a special postage rate, a special envelope for mailing tax returns, and special delivery routes so that tax returns can be sent in. So this arrangement was lauded by the National State Administration of Taxation and popularized across the country. So quite a bit of local experimentation and resource mobilization was required for this place to work to start. There's other evidence to show that in the late 1990s, the 2 or 3 years after the 1997 tax administration reform, launched a regime of tax compliance and administration. that matched the announced reform agenda of the State Council. Okay, and then this regime began to fade away. So the 1994 reform, starting implementation in 1997, announced a regime that is familiar from the perspective of modern taxation, but very quickly that regime faded away. And that's reflected in all these downward sloping curves on this slide. I will show you. This is the number of auditors in China, tax inspectors in China, starting from the early 2000s. So we don't see, the data doesn't reach back to the 1990s, but what we see here is that there was a decline starting around 2002 and 2003. Tax inspection was going to be a major thing that tax administrators did. Instead, the numbers started dwindling around this time. This is a trend about the number of taxpayers inspected. And so when the State Council said that the biggest thing you have to do is to audit taxpayers, that's what tax administrators did in the late 1990s. And very rapidly, audit coverage suffered a major decline. The quantity of tax litigation in China reached its height in the late 1990s. And so remember, law was going to be very important. Tax was going to collect it according to law. So there may be disputes, there will be tax litigation. Yes, there was tax litigation. And then the quantity of tax litigation rapidly declined. And then finally, for tax whistleblowing, that's not supposed to be a major institution, but it is complementary to this idea of a self-assessment. And so people are supposed to comply with the law. How do tax administrators get to know if there are people cheating? Whistleblowing is a natural solution to that problem. So there was a lot of whistleblowing at the end of the 1990s, but then we also saw a rapid decline. So hopefully this shows you that something happened in China, but had a very temporary duration. A modern tax regime was put into place, but lost its relevance very quickly. To explain what happened, I want to take a step back from China and spend a little time talking about theories of modern taxation. With just a little bit of theory, the discussion of obscure Chinese phenomena will hopefully become more accessible and more memorable. Okay. So a key concept of China's 1994 tax reform was that the new tax system was going to be based on self-assessment. Okay. The concept of self-assessment is mentioned in practical circles. For example, when the IMF gives advice to developing countries about how to build a tax system, you read about self-assessment. It's rarely discussed in scholarship. The concept is very simple. Taxpayers and other private parties, such as agents responsible for withholding, need to acquaint themselves with the rules that determine their liability and obligations under tax law. They apply such rules to themselves and make declarations and payments to the government accordingly. Self-assessment is the primary method that modern taxes, such as the VAT, the sales taxes, income taxes, and payroll taxes are collected. Okay. So here on this slide, I show you a number of claims about self-assessment that are fairly simple. So the aim is to convey a certain logic. Okay. So the first claim is that self-assessment is the pillar of much modern taxation. I distinguish self-assessment from the more often used term voluntary compliance. Self-assessment is a legal obligation that's enforced. And so there's not a lot that's voluntary. You can't enforce voluntary compliance, you can enforce self-assessment. Self-assessment also assumes that there are ex ante knowable rules, so I know what to do. So those simple points stress the fact that self-assessment actually implies a background legal system. Audits enforce the obligation of accurate self-assessment, and therefore the very concept of audit in taxation also assumes a background legal system. So for economists who think about tax administration and tax evasion, the standard model of tax evasion, economic model of tax evasion, is by Allingham and Sandmo from 1972. And that's based on a model familiar to legal scholars, which is Becker's theory, deterrence theory about crime, criminal behavior. And so the problem of income tax evasion, as conceived by economists, assumes the concept of audit. And so it actually assumes a background legal system in operation. Okay. Another conceptual point to make about self-assessment is the enforcement of self-assessment obligations is necessarily ex post. And so taxpayers decide to comply or not, and then the government do something about that. And taxpayers make the decision to comply or not in view of what might happen after that decision is made and the acts undertaken. So what government enforcement, when you have a self-assessment system, essentially what the government is trying to do is to make taxpayers unwilling to cheat. It does not make taxpayers unable to cheat. Taxpayers can always cheat. They just have to face consequences. So this theory has two more points. Accurate self-assessment, namely truthful reporting, is a legal norm that's enforced both publicly and privately. So this is a claim that's less conventional. The claim is that, who's enforcing truthful reporting? The government clearly is doing that. There's the threat of audit and penalties. But in addition, that's enforced privately. I would argue that just because a lot of business firms need to enforce legal norms in their workplace, they tend to enforce truthful reporting norms as a part of legal norms. It's part of following the law. And so there's a complementarity between legal norms and business firms. So I'll come back to this. And so I wrote a paper about this in 2018. It hasn't really persuaded a lot of people, but I want to show you how it contrasts with other theories of tax compliance and how it shows you that we need a new language talking about developments in places like China. And the final point is that ex ante interventions. So if the government can do something before taxpayer cheats, that can disable non-compliance and render ex post interventions unnecessary. So the main example, the easiest example I would give this is for property taxation. So when we're homeowners, we wait to get a notice of an assessment from the government every year. We don't have to file a return, and the government never have to audit us because the government already observes what the tax base is, and we simply have to pay. Okay, and so when the government has a power of observation, it doesn't need for you to engage in self-assessment. Ex ante interventions will be a perfect substitute for self-assessment. But ex ante interventions are conditional on the government's power of observation. So with that logic, let me just show you how we have standard theories of compliance, tax administration, with which we understand modern tax systems works this way. So people usually would say that why do we observe the level of tax compliance in Canada, the United States, advanced economies? People really appeal to two kinds of factors. One is there's audits and penalties, which provide economic, pecuniary, extrinsic motivations for compliance. And so people do not cheat because they fear being penalized. What we do know is that the audit rate and penalty rates in most countries are pretty low. And so for people who are intent on cheating, that's not enough to create a sufficient deterrence. So this is an important fact. Well, so what else is producing compliance? What about intrinsic motivations? People simply saying that paying taxes is doing the right thing. There are fairly convincing studies to show that when a tax is not enforced, the compliance rate is very low. So there are people who are intrinsically motivated to comply with the law, but that portion is pretty small. And we know this from real world experience. So in the United States, the nanny tax, the payroll taxes you're supposed to collect on hiring a child caregiver is routinely evaded. In Canada, individual consumers are supposed to collect the GST when they make purchases from foreign vendors. They never do that. They never remit that to the government. It's written in the law. People never do it. And there's a recent study coming out of Germany that says Germany has a church tax. People have to pay a small tax based on how much taxable income they show on their personal tax return. And when it was not enforced, even something like a church tax had a compliance, only 20% of people complied with it. So on the basis of low to moderate intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivations, why do we observe a lot of compliance? The theory offered by economists, the most, I think, noted theory, the most widely followed theory is that the government has capacities to make taxpayers unable to cheat, and that's through third-party information reporting. And so individuals can't cheat because their employers already told the government how much taxable income they are, something like that. Okay. So that is the conventional theory. So here's a different theory, modern taxation as based on legal norms. And so this is my own theory. And I subject my students to it. I want to show that it's notably different. You don't have to be persuaded by the theory, but I just want to notice how it's different from standard theory. So we still assume low and moderate intrinsic motivation, low and moderate extrinsic motivation, because audit and penalties are just not likely enough, and the level of those are not high enough. But there's complementarity between legal norms and firms. So information reporting and withholding requirements are actually acts of self-assessment performed by businesses, by employers, by financial institutions. They're not subject to any sufficient sanctions. And so we have to ask, why do they do it? And a possible explanation is that firms come to, people come together to form a firm in the first place to profit legally. And so people tend to comply with the law. And the larger a firm, the easier to achieve coordination when you comply with legal norms. So this is the key explanation. And once you have this, it's not necessary to have ex ante enforcement. So what economists call ex ante enforcement through information reporting actually is just institutional based law-abiding behavior. Okay. So that's just theory. Let me show you what China has. The aim is to discuss what China's practice is. So here's China. Intrinsic motivation to comply with the law, I haven't done research. Let's assume that it's low. It's typically low in developing countries, low-income countries with inadequate government services. Even if assume it's low, it's not very different from what we see in advanced economies. What's striking are the following three factors. The government deliberately makes the penalty rate very low. Okay. And the government does not inform legal norms of truthful reporting, the legal obligations of assessment. Instead, the government maximizes observation and intervention through a variety of devices, but most importantly, as I showed you, through physical proximity to taxpayers. This is what the 60,000 tax offices or 30,000 tax offices are for. And so in terms of ex ante interventions, China has the most of. Okay. So that would be a conceptual way of describing what China does that's different. And let me get to some concrete examples of what that means in practice. Let me show you several things. There are some very successful ex-ante interventions in China that are breathtaking. So here is a table from the year 2000 that shows the percentage of timely tax registration and timely return filing. Remember, China was pretty poor then, sub-Saharan GDP per capita, level of GDP per capita. And what you see here, here are the percentages. You see everything is above 90. So more than 90% of business that should be registered for tax purposes are registered, okay? Similarly, if you look at, this is timely filing tax returns, the level for businesses is consistently above 90%. Some in some places getting close to 100%. That's way higher than what you see in Canada. Okay. The same very high metrics apply to timely payment of taxes. More than 90% of taxpayers promptly pay taxes according to official reports. Okay. How is this achieved? So this is not going to happen if you just wait for taxpayers to do these things. Tax administrators have to intervene. And so basically, there's a lot of monitoring and handholding and making sure that whatever happens, you file your tax return on time. And these are mostly helping businesses. And whatever your true tax liability is, you need to declare something, and that something has to be paid on time. So these are the results of high ex-ante interventions. However, the government can intervene only along several margins. These are one of the few, among the few margins that the government can enforce compliance on. When that does not happen, compliance rate drops a lot. And so here's something that's produced, we recently produced in a working paper showing how many firms that are formally registered with tax authorities pay social insurance contributions. And the rate, you see, this is revenue decile, so firms by their size classified by revenue. In the lowest decile of firms, they're all registered for tax purposes. Only slightly above 20% of firms pay social insurance contributions when that requirement is mandatory. So there's an extremely high amount of non-compliance for firms that are even registered. So the idea is that firms can comply along several margins, such as timely filing tax returns, timely payment, business registration, but failing on many other margins. Here's another concrete example that shows you basically how unusual Chinese tax collection practice is. We show something, this shows something called mandatory taxpayer self-inspection. So the government suspects that some taxpayers do not pay enough tax. So taxpayers of a particular type in a particular sector tend to evade taxes. So what they do, instead of checking their tax returns, is to go to them and say, we're going to be inspecting you. Please inspect yourself first and see whether you owe previously unpaid taxes. And if you did, declare that, pay that, and we won't impose any penalties. Okay, so in the West, that's known as tax amnesties, but in China, that's done as a part of routine tax inspection, done every year. So much so that the revenue collected from self-inspections roughly matches that revenue collected from government audits. Okay, so this shows an unusual phenomena of mandatory taxpayer self-inspections, but also of just not imposing penalties. Okay. All right, so those are some concrete examples. Major Chinese tax administration practices that deviate from Western paradigms would include, as I said, high firm formality. So the underground economy in China actually is quite small, has been small for a long time. This is a very important fact that scholars haven't really studied. There's high levels of compliance along several margins. There's also a very strong taxpayer service. That's a good thing. And so the pictures of the smiling faces that I show you are genuine. You can see a lot of them. And taxpayers' satisfaction, government surveys, how good is our service? That's quite high. There's high labor informality in terms of whether social insurance contributions are paid. There's disuse of penalties. There's taxpayer self-inspections. In my book, I talk about other phenomena that are quite unusual. There's something called quasi-compliance, which is complying with what your local tax administrator tells you to do. Forget about what the law says. Okay, so I'm compliant with something, it's just not the law. And there's something called atomism. So the Chinese tax administration, even now, has trouble keeping track of taxpayers' records. And so, in China, we have these powerful tech companies that have the technology to do everything online so that you have a cashless economy. Tax administration cannot keep track of taxpayers' records. Okay, so all of these practices show how unusual, how unlike the paradigm described in 1994 is actually in place. Through these choices, Chinese taxation has substantially diverged from the Western model it aimed to import. So I want to wrap up. Why is this all interesting? So one thing to ask is, what are some explanations? Why did this happen? Why did China abandon the intent of implementing Western-style tax administration? So in my book, I offer a couple of explanations. It has to do with personnel management. And so there's something about having those 600,000 people already by 1994. You have to give them something to do, and they can be trained to do certain things and not other things. That's one part of it. There's also interaction with the political system in China. So I won't get into that, but the point to make is, if you ask this question, why did a country adopt the tax administration system it did, there's no general explanation. There's no social scientific theory. And so about 10 years ago, Tim Besley and Torsten Persson, two very influential political economists, highlighted the importance of thinking about this question. And so this is around the time when they wrote the book, Pillars of Prosperity, and their hypothesis is that there are important political determinants of the structure of tax administration. There has been very little work since then developing this idea further. So my speculations are not great, but at least I think this is an important question to consider. So this is my final slide. Why do we care about this? What is remarkable about this story? I think it's remarkable for the following 4 reasons. First, what we have had in China since the early 2000s in the sphere of taxation is an alternative form of state capacity that collects modern taxes while relying much less significantly on legal ordering, on legal norms than other countries. Okay, and so basically before China, we never thought that you can collect these modern taxes without self-assessment. And China provided this unique experiment showing how you can do that. Okay. The strange thing is that the way China does it is not inconsistent with recommendations of economic theory. And so, as I showed you earlier, so the economic theory suggests that we in Canada, in the US, we must be succeeding in collecting taxation through ex-ante interventions because our penalty and audit rates are too low, our intrinsic motivations are not very high. We must be doing something outright. We must be intervening effectively. That actually describes China better than it describes what happens in Canada and the US. So this idea of an alternative form of state capacity is very important. In this form of state capacity, the legal system is rendered irrelevant for governance. And so basically, I would say in the vast sphere of Chinese taxation, administrators dispense with the thin conception of rule of law. There's no rule by law. People don't need to know what the law is. Law is not enforced. And so, really forget about robust conceptions of rule of law. Law is simply put out of play. So this is very important because we, especially as legal scholars, we hear debates about whether China is adopting its own version of law. That's not Western conception of rule of law. I find that debate very unsatisfying because when you look at the reality of governance, law simply has no place. Okay, an alternative for law has been found. It's really important. So the system appears to be stable and actually not incompatible with technological future. So when we think that technology is going to deliver more information to the government in a faster fashion, the government can process more information, it's going to be able to conduct more ex ante interventions. Okay, and so even other countries may evolve in this direction. Okay. And then finally, really importantly, so from the Western perspective, I think I myself as a tax scholar, I look at the Chinese tax system, I think this is very inefficient because everything is not the way how it's supposed to be done. And we can analyze a lot of inefficiencies in tax policy that may be attributable to this form of tax administration. So if you care about efficiency, economists care about efficiency. The Chinese answer is that, well, how fast do you want China to grow? We're already, growing fast enough. We don't need to be more efficient. All right. So whatever inefficiencies you're complaining about, it doesn't matter. But actually, I think that's already very interesting to think about. But a more important point is that the system is actually not obviously unjust. So it's very different from our system. But it has collected a substantial amount of revenue, it has sustained a substantial amount of income distribution to, so people have read about the poverty alleviation campaign in China, but well beyond that, China set up urban and rural healthcare and pension systems in the last 15 years, mainly through general revenue. And so those are breathtaking achievements. This is a system that I feel that one has to come to terms with. It's very unexpected. And as I said, there's this analogy about China's rise in the world complying, sort of following Western expectations or not. The story that I offered describes a purely domestic development, right? Really, there's no foreign portion. But you can see the same logic, which is the country started out on something, thinking that it's going to follow a model that's well known elsewhere in the world, and it moved into a different system that has worked surprisingly well, and it's hard to understand. And so, if we simply take it for granted that modern taxation has to be based on self-assessment and so on, we really wouldn't be able to talk about this system.